All right, let's get comfortable and dive into this stack of sources you sent our way. We're tackling a really intense and, well, pretty multi-layered situation here.
Yeah, it's all centered around recent events in Los Angeles, specifically these anti-ICE protests and the complex web of responses that sort of unfolded afterwards.
Exactly. And you've given us quite a mix here, haven't you? We've got major news outlets like Fox News, some local reports too, WCSI, Patch.
The New Republic for a historical angle, which
Yeah,
is interesting. And then, snapshots of the online chatter from TikTok, Reddit, even some Wikipedia excerpts. It's quite a collection.
it really is. It shows just how many different takes you can get on, well, basically the same event.
hmm And our mission today really is to navigate these different perspectives, pull out the key info from your sources, and try to make sense of these sometimes conflicting narratives.
It's about understanding the information landscape itself, right? Not just the events. Okay, so let's start by grounding ourselves. What actually happened on the ground? According to these sources, we're talking about anti-ICE demonstrations, downtown LA, June 2025, near LAPD headquarters and City Hall specifically.
Right. And the sources initially describe, typical protest scenes, people gathered, waving flags. Mexican flags are mentioned in some reports, chanting slogans.
No justice, no peace, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But there are also mentions pretty early on of things getting a bit less peaceful. Water bottles being thrown at law enforcement, for instance.
Ah, okay. And this seems to be where, according to several reports anyway, things escalate quite a bit.
Yeah.
We start seeing details about rioters smashing windows at LAPD headquarters,
Yeah.
authorities using tear gas.
And the sources mention cars being burned, police vehicles vandalized. It definitely went beyond just, peaceful demonstrating at that point, based on these accounts.
And that escalation naturally led to a significant law enforcement response.
It did. Your sources mentioned 41 arrests were made, and that was across different agencies, LAPD, California Highway Patrol, the LA Sheriff's Department, too.
And the charges, what were they seeing?
Well, it was a range. Things like failure to disperse, which you'd expect, but also more serious charges like assault with a deadly weapon on a police officer, looting, and even arson.
Now, one detail that really jumped out, and it was kind of buried in that Reddit thread you
Oh,
shared,
okay.
was a reference someone made to a body being found near looted stores, which sounds incredibly serious.
Wow, yeah.
And this is crucial, another user in that exact same Reddit thread pointed out, citing a local article, that the cause of death was actually unknown. It wasn't confirmed to be linked to the riots at all.
Ah, okay. That's a really good example of how quickly claims can surface and how contested they can become, especially in online discussions. Shows you need to read the whole thread.
Absolutely. So on the official side, what were the police doing?
Well, the LAPD declared an unlawful assembly. They ordered everyone to leave, basically saying they expected the area to become unsafe.
Standard procedure in that kind of situation.
Pretty much. And they also went on tactical alert, which means all uniformed personnel had to stay on duty, keep everyone available.
And then there's the federal angle mentioned in one source. Something about Attorney General Pam Bondi.
Yeah, that source noted Bondi mentioning they'd identified a suspect for assaulting a federal officer, specifically throwing rocks. The plan was apparently to get a search warrant, maybe even put them on the most wanted list.
Okay, so that leads us nicely into the next big piece of this puzzle that really comes through in the sources. This very visible, often pretty confrontational interaction between the federal response and California's state leadership.
Right. This is where things get really tense. The sources detail the Trump administration's actions authorizing the deployment of thousands of National Guard troops.
And Marines too, right?
And Marines, yeah. Specifically 700 Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division. That level of detail is provided.
And the stated reason for bringing in the military.
According to the sources, it was to protect federal personnel and federal property, and they'd be working alongside other federal forces operating under what's called Title 10 authority.
Which basically means federal command separate from the state.
Exactly. Though, it's interesting, your sources also note there was some uncertainty about the Marines' specific rules for using force, and that they weren't supposed to be acting in a direct law enforcement role with civilians. Kind of a gray area there.
And didn't President Trump weigh in directly? I think that TikTok source mentioned something.
Yes, it did. It included his statement mentioning the possibility of invoking the Insurrection Act if he deemed the situation in LA an insurrection. That obviously added a whole other layer of tension.
You can imagine. And the FBI got involved too.
Launched their own investigation. They were looking into whether there was an organized criminal conspiracy behind the riots and focusing specifically on prosecuting violence against federal officers or damage to government property.
So a very federal focus.
Very much so. U.S. Attorney Bill Asalee is quoted reinforcing that, basically saying, if you impede or interfere with federal authorities, you'll be arrested and prosecuted.
Okay, so that's the federal side.
Yeah.
But the sources make it clear California's state government saw this very, very differently.
Oh, absolutely. The pushback was immediate and forceful. Governor Gavin Newsom is quoted extensively. He called the federal deployment unwarranted, uncalled for, and unprecedented. Strong words.
Yeah, doesn't sound like he was holding back.
Not at all. He apparently characterized it as being about stroking a dangerous president's ego, even called it un-American, and a step toward authoritarianism. Really strong language.
And he didn't just use words, right? The sources mention legal action.
That's right. He filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration and the defense secretary. The grounds were reckless abuse of executive power and inflammatory escalation.
Wow. And the mayor of L.A., Karen Bass.
She also weighed in, notably by issuing reminders to illegal immigrants about their rights, the right to remain silent, not having to lie about status, needing a warrant for home entry, that kind of thing.
Which seems pointed given the context of anti-IC protests.
It does. And she also pretty directly blamed the Trump administration for, in her view, creating the crisis in the first place.
And Newsom was physically there in L.A.
Yeah, the sources say he went to Los Angeles to oversee the state's response personally. He was quoted saying his focus was on keeping the peace, not playing into what he called Trump's political games.
It's interesting, though. Wasn't there something about his office initially downplaying the Marine movement?
Yes, that's a nuance in the reporting. His office's initial characterization was apparently much softer, just describing it as Marines moving from one base to another, a stark contrast to his later statements.
And how did the feds respond to California's pushback?
Well, contrasting sharply, you had the federal Homeland Security Department issuing statements urging California politicians to essentially call off their rioting mob.
Oof.
Yeah, and questioning why the governor was, in their words, siding with foreign criminals. So very different framing.
And just to add another layer, what about Republicans within California?
The sources include that perspective, too. The California GOP leadership is reported as blaming Democrats for what they saw as lawlessness. They called the protests organized crime and were critical of protesters waving foreign flags, saying it was like conquerors.
So immediately you see these events just refracted through completely different political prisms right there in the source material.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a really core challenge when you're looking at events like this through multiple sources. How are they being framed?
Right.
And your sources actually offer a really fascinating historical parallel that kind of helps illuminate this whole framing issue. It takes us back to the 1992 Los Angeles riots.
Yes. The New Republic piece you included reflects on documentaries about the '92 riots, obviously sparked by the Rodney King verdict.
Right. And it highlights how that video of King's beating, the one filmed by George Holliday on his home camera,
Changed everything.
exactly. The article argues it essentially jammed the clockwork of history. It points to how the rise of affordable home video cameras back in the 70s and 80s, marketed with all this empowering language, sort of paved the way for citizen journalism.
And changed what we could see and how we saw it. America's Funniest Home Videos wasn't the only outcome, I guess.
No, definitely not. The piece mentions that the documentaries about 92 lean heavily on these now iconic video clips. The chants outside the courthouse, helicopter shots of looting.
Those harrowing scenes on 77th Street,
Yeah.
Korean store owners defending their businesses, journalists reporting right in the middle of it all.
And it notes the, the grainy quality of that older footage, which itself has a certain feel.
But then there's also that firsthand account you provided from a photographer who was actually there in '92. That gives a different kind of texture.
It really does. It's much more ground level. He talks about anticipating trouble after the verdict, but being just completely unprepared for the scale of the devastation he saw in South Central LA.
He uses phrases like, whole blocks were leveled by fire and destroyed by vandals.
Yeah. He recounts being cursed at, having rocks thrown at him. He gives that specific, heartbreaking example of a destroyed John Muir Branch library and the reaction of the city librarian and Debbie Allen seeing it.
And he contrasts that devastation with the relatively minor unrest he saw in his own neighborhood, which is an important distinction.
It is. And your sources also draw a line connecting this history to figures active today, like Maxine Waters, noting her role back in '92 as an official representing one of the riot zones, channeling her anger at the system.
Right, and her Wikipedia entry, which you included an excerpt of, even has that section on confrontationalism with the 1992 riots listed as a subsection.
So bringing that historical context, that memory of 1992, back to the recent 2025 events, really highlights another major theme running through your sources. These conflicting narratives about the very nature of the protests, especially around the idea of violence.
Okay, yeah, this is where it gets really complex and maybe pretty confusing for anyone trying to follow along.
Definitely.
Because one source's headline, just the headline, attributes a claim to Maxine Waters saying that the recent LA riots, the 2025 ones, weren't violent.
Yeah.
And that you shouldn't believe what you see.
Right. And the reaction to that specific type of statement, which you see reflected very clearly in the Reddit source.
That's pretty strong.
It's visceral, yeah. People immediately bring up George Orwell, 1984, that whole idea of being told to reject the evidence of your own senses. Don't trust your lying eyes. There's a lot of disbelief that visible damage and conflict could be framed that way.
And the sources also bring up some past comments attributed to Waters, but from a different context, the Derek Chauvin trial back in 2021.
That's right, where she reportedly encouraged protesters to get more active, get more confrontational if a guilty verdict didn't come down, and she apparently dismissed the curfew that was in place.
And the judge in that trial reacted strongly too.
He did. He called those comments abhorrent and suggested they might even be grounds for an appeal later. So that history is part of the context people are bringing to this current discussion.
And it's maybe worth noting that Wikipedia excerpt you shared on Maxine Waters' political positions. As of June 2025, it literally has a note saying the section needs expansion with Waters' views on political violence.
Which is telling, isn't it? It suggests that even a source like Wikipedia, which tries to compile information, sees this as an area that's still contested or not fully documented.
Yeah. So all of this really fuels this big debate that bubbles up in your sources, especially in that Reddit discussion. What actually counts as violence during a protest?
How do we apply these terms, peaceful versus violent? And you see people raising arguments about potential hypocrisy.
Like comparing the 2025 LA events to, say, January 6th or other protests, and asking if the definitions are being applied consistently. That comes up in the Reddit comments.
It does. And one specific point raised there is, if a protest has a significant minority committing felonies, arson, looting, serious assault, and the majority either can't or won't stop them, can the whole event still be called peaceful? It's a tough question.
Another comment suggests that when authorities seem to deny or downplay visible violence, it might actually, maybe inadvertently, enable it to continue.
That's another perspective raised. And then, amidst all these layers, the events, the spin, the history, the definitions, you get that one comment in the Reddit source that just kind of captures the core difficulty, right?
Yeah, the one basically saying it's hard to know the truth fully without being there yourself, given all the biases and potential misinformation flying around.
Exactly. Which brings us right back to the challenge of navigating this whole information landscape you've presented us with.
So when we look across this whole collection you provided, the blow-by-blow of the 2025 events, this really intense state versus federal fight,
The conflicting political narratives, that historical shadow of 1992 and how video evidence plays into it, and this very live debate about what violence even means in these situations.
we don't get a single, simple story.
Not at all. What we see are layers upon layers of information, interpretation, and frankly, conflict. These sources show the same events through vastly different lenses.
You've got official reports, political statements from totally opposing sides, historical analysis, deeply personal accounts, and then that raw, unfiltered public reaction and debate online.
It's a really clear demonstration, I think, of how understanding complex, fast-moving events requires wading through exactly this kind of diverse, often contradictory material.
So diving into your specific stack of sources hopefully gives you, the listener, a shortcut to being better informed, not by giving you the answer.
But by laying out the different arguments, the different pieces of evidence, the different perspectives that are out there, it shows you what different people saw, what they claimed, and how things like past events or even just the technology we use, like video cameras, shape the stories we tell about what's happening.
Exactly. And it really leaves you with this pretty powerful question to chew on, doesn't it? When events are unfolding in real time, captured through so many different eyes, filtered through so many lenses, and framed by so many powerful voices, including some who might even tell you not to believe what seems obvious. How do you decide what's real?
Yeah, how do you process what you're seeing and hearing when these strong narratives, steeped in history and political agendas, are actively trying to shape or maybe even deny your own interpretation of what's right there in front of you?
That's definitely something to think about long after this deep dive is over.